Very much for this kind introduction. Yeah, you already announced my co-authors, as you can see the names here. So I would like to start then directly with the content. So let me present to you how the talk is structured in the following. First, I'm going to start off a very brief overview of the state of the art in the end-to-end analysis of the stochastic network calculus. Then it's going to be followed up by one of the biggest challenges in the end-to-end analysis. It is how we deal with dependence. Afterwards, I'm going to present like related work on this specific topic. And then it is followed by our technique. It is, as the title suggests, how we unleash the power of paying multiplexing only once in the SNC. And then last but not least, we are going to compare our new technique with the state of the art and see how this impacts performance in comparison. So let me now present the state of the art analysis. So for this, as we often call it, canonical tandem, it has been shown that the service curve presented here can be provided. It basically follows this, you can subtract first and convolve afterwards, also known as separated flow analysis. And if we additionally assume that all flows are assumed to be stochastically independent, the analysis is very efficient, as we see now in a moment. So we take the service process here, and then we can insert it due to the modular network calculus framework into the bound on the delay violation probability. Okay, and what we see here as the terms appear then in the exponent, we can further simplify using the union bound and so on and so forth. And since we can then exploit the independence, we get then an end-to-end result. However, what might be surprising is if we change the topology to this interleaved tandem, and even though it's only 3 servers, the analysis itself already gets more involved. So using the separated flow analysis, we obtain the following end-to-end servers. And without like looking at the details, is what is noticeable that we have multiple reappearing terms, even though it's just this 3-node example. So since we then insert it and we have all these expressions in the exponent, that means that, I mean, and obviously stochastic process cannot be independent of itself. It means that we have to consider dependence in the analysis. So to summarize the situation, under the SFA, we observe dependent processes, even if we assume all processes when they enter the network are independent. That's why we coined the term method pertinent here. So we call this type method pertinent dependence. Okay. So the analysis, of course, is not done here. So the basic technique is to continue by using Hölder's inequality. However, it comes with 2 major drawbacks. One is we observe a severe loss of accuracy. And we can see that easily if we compare, if we plot delay against violation probability, and we compare our calculated bounds with the quantiles of the delay simulation. And then we see that the bounds quickly degrade. So due to this substantial gap, we see then that the inaccuracy, we can observe then this inaccuracy. And the other downside is actually also non-negligible. It's the fact that we quickly increase the parameter space. So each application of Hölder's inequality gets us another parameter to optimize. And since we end up with a non-linear, often non-convex optimization problem, the computational effort quickly increases. So actually, there is some work in order to mitigate this issue, or rather say alleviate the problem. So one that has been presented is the so-called sequential PMO. It has been applied to tandem networks and SIG trees. And what this technique has in common is the fact that we are able to avoid these method pertinent dependencies, but so far it was only limited to nested interference structures. Actually, it can be applied to interleaved interference structure. This is inspired by the so-called tandem matching analysis for the DNC. So here we apply so-called cutting, for example, between the nodes S2 and S3 or S1 and S2. However, even if we simplify the situation, for example, by assuming a certain priority, because usually we just assume arbitrary multiplexing, either way, we still end up with method pertinent dependencies. So let me now summarize the situation. A scalable analysis for the topologies that contain interleaved interference structure still remains an open problem. Okay, let me now present to you our approach here. It is the PMO analysis now in the SNC. So we assume a set of flows. We assume like kind of the very typical assumptions, work conserving servers, and that are traversed by flow of interest. Then we use this dot notation. This is just used to denote the successor that is unique in these tree networks. And then we can prove that the flow of interest sees the following leftover service. It is the dynamic end-to-end S server offered to this server can be described by this expression here. And just to give a glimpse idea of the proof idea, it is basically can be interpreted as a bivariate generalization of the DNC result. And yeah, for more details, I would like to refer to the paper that has been published this year, as you mentioned. So let me now show you how this is applied to our toy tandem interleaved network of 3 nodes. So coming back to this small example, we obtain the following end-to-end service process that is given here. And what is noticeable directly is the fact that we have no reappearing terms. So in other words, there are no method pertinent dependencies that are to be considered. So, and oh, sorry, one thing I also wanted to mention. We can actually deduce its shape directly just by looking at the topology. That's how intuitive it is. So the time variables for the service, they're just like increasing by 1, but the time variables for the arrival processes, they match for the according positions when the flows enter or leave the network. So for example, SA2, we have the time variables S and T3. S is because it enters the network at server S1, which is the same as for the service process S1, and at T3 here because it exits the network at S2, which is the time variable here. And this applies to all cross flows. Okay, we use analytic combinatorics to ease the complex calculations. So the thing is, since we assume a discrete time scenario, the arrival processes and service processes, they can basically just be described by, they're just sequences. So therefore we can derive the so-called generating function or Z transform. And that is given here by this expression. And an important example is the so-called geometric sequence, because here we can directly derive a closed form solution. And of course, very important example, all sigma rho constraint processes are geometric. So they fall into this class. It has pretty advantageous properties. For example, the min plus convolution directly maps to the Cauchy product, and the min plus deconvolution maps to the Adamar product if the first argument is geometric. Then we do not have to calculate basically the backlog output or delay bound entirely. In fact, we provide a modular technique, and we only need to provide a bound on the generating function on the service, and then we calculate the performance bounds afterwards. So to summarize the theorem, so we assume here all service and arrival process to be independent sigma rho bounded, then we can derive a closed form solution for the service bounding generating function that is given here. And once we obtain that result, we can basically ask, okay, what is a delay bound? Well, actually, there's a closed form now for the bounding generating function of the delay violation probability. And the delay violation probability itself is just taking the teeth term of this associated sequence. Okay, so it further adds modularity to the analysis. Okay, and therefore in the following we call it PMO-AC because it's the pay multiplexing only once analysis that employs the analytic combinatorics. So let us now have a look on the impact on the accuracy of the bounds. So coming back to the interleaved tandem, for the state of the art, as we have to consider method pertinent dependencies, we observe a substantial gap between calculated bounds as well as the quantiles of the delay simulation. And if we now add our new PMO-AC analysis, we see that the gap is basically cut by half. And what is also noticeable is the fact that if we consider the scaling behavior, so to say, so we observe that if we decrease the violation probability, the gap to the state of the art actually further increases, whereas the PMO-AC is kind of able to mimic the exact same slope. Okay. And yeah, so if we keep the shape here, but we extend the length, then of course the impact is much more substantial compared to this toy example. So this is what we call the extended interleaved tandem. And then in contrast to the previous one, we fix the delay violation probability to 10 to the -6 and just see how this impacts the simulations and the bounds once we increase the number of servers. And then we see, of course, directly that the state of the art bound quickly degrades in comparison to simulations. But this is not the case for the PMO-AC. So not only are we way closer, we stay also close for a much longer time once we increase the number of servers. And of course, what is noticeable here is that we only calculated bounds for the state of the art for only 3 data points. And the reason is that the runtimes quickly explode. So we can get the bound for the 3 server case in like more than 5 seconds, but it already takes 1.5 hours just for adding 2 more data points. For the PMO-AC, on the other hand, it's all calculated bounds can be done in less than 0.7 seconds because there's only one parameter theta to be optimized. So yeah, that's why we see this large explosion for the state of the art in comparison to the PMO-AC. Okay, so actually the analysis is the theorem itself, as you saw, is already extended to 3 networks. Actually, it is not limited to that topology. We provide an approach that can be extended to so-called 3 reducible networks. So that means the network actually has to be only 3 from the flow of interest perspective, which further increases the topologies that we can calculate bounds for. And going to this topology, we see that the state of the art, as expected, has multiple method pertinent dependencies. And again, since we do not have to consider method pertinent dependencies at all, we don't observe any of them here. Also, what is quite striking is the following aspect. The output bounds that are to be calculated can be found here in the infimum. So in other words, instead of calculating this standard output bound, we can transform the calculation so it can be like moved into the infimum. Okay, then yeah. So looking at the impact on the accuracy of the bounds, we again observe a substantial improvement in comparison to the state of the art. Actually, there's more to that. So the analysis is not limited to 3 reducible networks. In fact, we open the door for a first step for a general feed-forward network. In order to exemplify this, we look at the following so-called diamond network. So this is obviously not 3 reducible because the flows F1 and F2 rejoin at server S3. However, we can alleviate the situation here by applying the so-called cutting technique. And since we have only 4 nodes here, there are basically just 2 cut options. One is between S0 and S2, and the other is in the top right corner between S2 and S3. And what's important here is that both cut options lead to valid and rigorous upper bounds. The reason is that we do not assume the cross flow F2 and F2 prime. We do not assume them to be independent. So in other words, we preserve their dependent structure. Okay. Okay. So, but the thing is, because we do not have a tree reducible network, we cannot avoid now applying Hölder's inequality. So because in other words, we left the Hölder free space. Sorry, one thing I forgot. Actually, there are other techniques, but we would like to refer to them in the technical report. So in our PMO AC technique, we now, because it's a feed-forward network, we also have to apply Hölder's inequality, but we still observe that both cut options that are shown here substantially improve upon the state of the art, even though we have to apply Hölder's inequality in both cases. So it's not just about like avoiding it entirely, it's also about how we apply it, and we can still benefit in the analysis from that. So let me now summarize the situation here. So the PMO, we have shown that the PMO analysis leads to significantly improved end-to-end delay bounds in the SNC analysis. But not only do we improve accuracy, we also reduce the computational effort because we're able to minimize the number of method pertinent dependencies. That means, in other words, we are able to obtain a scalable analysis of tree networks. So because in that case, we only have to optimize the theta parameter. And as I briefly mentioned, in fact, a generalization to tree reducible networks is provided. And then last but not least, we actually open the door for an SNC analysis of general feed-forward networks. However, admittedly, this is just a first step. So the thing is that, of course, the cutting offers many feasible alternatives. So one direction that one can continue here is to do an exhaustive search and in the cutting techniques to see, okay, what yields better bounds. Yeah, this hasn't been explored yet. Then one technique that can be applied, we actually also use it in the technical report, is the so-called tree unfolding. This is some like open and left direction. Also, what can be done is there's a technique that is called H mitigators to use to improve upon output bound calculations, but like how to integrate that into the PMO analysis is also an open topic. And the last one I would like to mention is the infamous martingale technique. So it has been shown to improve upon the SNC results. And if that one could be integrated into the PMO analysis, that would, of course, lead to significantly improved performance bounds in general. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, it's not. We have time for questions, so formulate your question. In the meantime, I have a short question. I didn't get the need for or why do you use the Z transform instead of Laplace transforms? What's the difference?
So you could, let me repeat the question. So the question was why do we use the generating functions or the Z transforms? And so you can do the entire PMO analysis without it. But the advantage is that that it's very modular. It's kind of I didn't prepare like proper examples, but there's like, okay, the generating service that can be done entirely, and then you can do all the performance bounds. And moreover, yeah, once you fix certain aspects of the topology, you can calculate modular aspects and don't have to redo the entire calculation from the start.
So what's the equivalent of the Chernoff bound in the Z transform? Or is
yeah, but the Chernoff and stuff, that still applies because we go to the MGF space using Chernoff, and once we are in the MGF space, then we do the Z transform.
Okay, so I have to. Yeah, thanks a lot. Any other questions? We would have time. I have some more, but I will take these offline. Not the only one discussing. All right, well, if that's not the case, then if there are no questions online, so okay, then,
okay.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.
presentation.